Personen in rechten Zeiten sowie des
La cantante de más de 200 ans a perdu 2% de la
rechten Teil an der Nordseite sowie des Außenbereichs des linksliegenden Weltbereichs.
Moving forward.
Thank you. Well, we decided, we've considered 3 or 4 decades of peri-urbanization. We'd like to know whether the sort of a standard image of people commuting long distances over long periods of time to get from home to work or services or shops or whatnot, is this still true? And we looked at 2 towns where there was an early phenomenon of peri-urbanization, the western part of the Greater Paris area near Val d'Oise and other areas where conurbations grew and sprawled relentlessly, but where now this has stabilized and you have a sort of a densification of these areas. And then that's the west of Paris and east of Paris. If you look, if you look at the south west of France with Albi and Toulouse, there you have a completely different situation. So we looked at population surveys and surveys amongst households, and you have these boxes on the map. So on the left-hand side, you have the western part of the Greater Paris area and the Toulouse area on the right-hand side. And you have the mobility patterns becoming more and more complex. There's more and more use of local resources, a stronger territorial anchoring, and we have some quantitative surveys looking specifically at what was found in the western part of Greater Paris, of the Greater Paris area, and this is in line with what was said earlier, namely that after a significant increase in commuting distances, as early until the 1980s, after the 1990s, things started to slow down and stabilize by the year 2000, even though there are better jobs being created. And so you look at the top executives and the lower echelon people, we find that between 1990 and 2006, the commuting distances haven't increased. So maybe this is because in the higher echelon jobs, this is because there were more women involved, and for the others, because there were more part-time jobs, but that's not the entire explanation. For the halfway solutions, you have, for the middle management, there was some increases in the commuting distances. For blue-collar workers, the distances were shorter, but that's also because there were fewer jobs altogether for blue-collar workers. So it seems as though we have reached a plateau. Now, it used to be that the these poles, these basins of jobs in Saint-Quentin and Yvelines and these areas had created jobs, and that also meant that people started building their own detached houses even further away. But now, if you look at the number of detached houses being built compared to houses being acquired or housing being acquired in Paris, there's no significant increase. Also in terms of commuting times or commuting distances, as we find that people get closer and closer to where they work, especially for you have working couples, and we find that the longer people live in the same house, the longer they are prepared to commute. Now, this is to be qualified in terms of the number of children, the ages of the children, the types of jobs, etc. And then we find in the statistics again that people will see their commuting distances reduced 2 or 5 years after they have moved out. And that is because, thankfully, the labor situation has improved in some areas with more local jobs being offered, especially jobs requiring physical presence. This means, of course, that there are new patterns emerging, the fact that you have a multi-center system rather than one center governing everything. But this is also due to the fact that Paris has become become saturated in terms of the time budget, the fact that transportation has reached its limit in terms of effectiveness, and so you have to look for solutions outside Paris. In terms of residential patterns, you have a stabilizing population, an aging population. West of Paris, people who own houses have been living there for 18 years on average, half of them for more than 15 years. One dweller in 4 has lived in the same house for the past 25 years. And so you have a well-anchored population, but half the population is age 55 or over. These, and we're talking about owning households, not the entire family is 55 years. The children, of course, are younger. There's also people moving rather from one house to another. They stay in the same town, and even if they move outside another town, it's never further than 5 or 10 kilometers away. And the average commuting distance within an area, that distance has come down from 27 to 23 kilometers on average. So people are commuting shorter distances. Again, in the western part of the Greater Paris area, more and more people come from further afield rather than from Paris. So the expectations are not the same in terms of shops and services and amenities, and so and also the commuting behaviors are not the same as those of the people who moved in of the earlier generation. And you have these areas being transfigured. You have people who get houses that are more in line with their expectations. So people want to have an older house or more greenery or better amenities, etc. And if you look at the high executives, and usually these are not the first-time home owners, and so their mortgages are over shorter periods of time, and so they can afford to move about, and they can make these small adjustments, move from one house to another without getting into debt. If you look at the younger population, again, these tend to stay in the same towns, and especially when there's a divorce or something, they tend to stay in the same area, if only because of the children. So you find that for the middle management jobs and the upper echelon jobs, people do tend to travel longer distances, commute longer distances than the lower echelons, and that difference is increasing. So you can really see along these lines a greater difference, but it also means that people who work and live locally also are better aware of what is available in terms of amenities and services and such like. And people are also concerned, living in areas where they know they can get jobs, and so that makes these areas more attractive. Now, the surveys we've conducted with households have confirmed these trends, and we can see that they are what we call secondary poles in the peri-urban sphere. So these secondary poles, secondary polarities, are different kinds. So you can have the traditional historical regional, capitals, as it were, these chefs-lieux, as they were called. And so there's a reason why people tend to move closer to the administrative center. You have average-sized towns such as Dreux or Chartres outside Paris, or Albi and Castres around Toulouse. So you have these sorts of towns. But then you have much smaller towns such as Houtin outside in the Paris area, or Lavore or Revel around Toulouse. These are much smaller towns. And then you have villages. I mean, not just not small towns, but small villages that can also be sort of become new poles of attraction. And we find among households people commuting around these centers. Reason people tend to move closer to these areas were for the facilities. They have amenities, they have shops, they can have access to small local services, and this is in line with what we said about the redistribution jobs of the labor market. Now, for people who've lived in these areas for longer periods of time, and so they're better anchored in the areas, again, we find that people they tend to regroup when there's cultural activities or leisure facilities available. So you have movie houses or even churches being used for cultural purposes. And so people have a new relationship with their towns, because they're not just there to find shops or basic services, but other amenities as well. And then you find that this is a sort of thing that you simply cannot find in the outer rings. For instance, specialized administrative service, medical services, or highly specialized cultural services. So that's why people tend to move into these small poles. And another survey has shown that households have strategies of their own, and it's not just it's not that people move simply because the property prices are lower. Sometimes there are family reasons. They want to get closer to their parents. They want to get closer to their children, and it's not just a matter of the property market. They may have other than strictly economic reasons. And then it also depends on how well equipped the towns may be. If you, or again, people want to find the right, they want to be halfway between different services available, and they find the happy medium between several services which they need. Now, this may be to do with the children, but then there could be other considerations where people want to become more involved in the local community. They might actually get involved in community affairs, or even to have some, who knows, sometimes in running the city in one way or another. Now, of course, while people tend to use their cars to travel, and the car has been, in a way, domesticated, nonetheless, public transportation remains significant. And then you have the soft versions, walking or cycling. And indeed, the local authorities have worked quite hard to make these modes of transportation more attractive when it comes to commuting between distant villages and local towns. They want to create these cycle paths or walking paths to make this possible. But also, some of this peri-urban landscape is now being revisited. You had, well, it's not just a matter of your social status. It's also a matter of having experience of a certain neighborhood. But we found that, say, you have working couples with 2 children. Of course, they look for property bargains or opportunities. But as I said, these are not the only reasons. You have people who, for instance, moved from one part of the country, moved out there for professional purposes, and when they retire, they wish to stay there, or maybe they decide to stay in this area simply because they know the area better, and rather than moving back to their original home, they want to stay in a home or in an area which they know better. It stands again to reason. Many of these working couples were former rural dwellers that have become peri-urban dwellers. These peri-urban areas have a history of their own, and so you might have farmers or craftsmen, or even the local elites, the solicitors, the doctors, families that used to live in rural areas that became urbanized. And then you have senior citizens, people who are pensioners. You have several kinds, people who decide to move out to these peri-urban areas when they retire, or people who decide to just remain there because they find that where they live, they have the best of both worlds, the city and the village, the attractiveness of a town with the safety of village. And then you have a younger population, people who've always lived there, the children of the new rural inhabitants, new rural dwellers who have grown there, who've grown up there rather, and they have their families nearby. And so what they decide to do is to stay in the general area but move closer, say, to a train station. And then you have people who are in dire financial or economic straits, and so they live from they find housing opportunities further out in the countryside and decide to start a new life where housing is cheaper. And then you have single-parent families, and they need special facilities to meet their own needs and expectations. And so these are all sorts of reasons why people might settle down in these areas. But then, so you have different categories, and so it's not just social classes, and you had also differences between Paris and Toulouse. You have the size of the urban pool that will make a difference, but also the age, as it were, the history. And in the Paris area, the process goes back many years, and that has enabled us to look at the degree to which people have set anchor, as it were, in these areas. And so you have this peri-urban space becoming thicker by the year, and so new resources become available. When there's awareness of these opportunities, of course, public policies seize upon them, but this also becomes part of the expectations of households living there. So it's a self-perpetuating circle. You want more, and then you demand more because you get more. And Lionel Rouget looked at people who are captive audiences, people who live in the peri-urban space outside Toulouse. But these are not necessarily, it's not just a case where people are sort of in difficult financial positions and have no choice. Many, having found a new ground, decide to stay there and redeploy their forces, as it were, to start a new life on the edge of cities. So even though their budget remains small, they find a happy medium there. They don't have to get stuck in traffic, in congestion, or likewise. They even though it was initially a sort of stopgap measure, that stopgap measure became a permanent settlement, as it were. When a family then develops there, then people tend to stay there. Likewise, for senior citizens, of course, when they live in a city, then they can shop in local shops, whereas the working people have no time during the day to do any shopping, and so these shops can survive economically. And so you have a new economic cycle emerging, and again, that will in turn bring about some sort of response from local authorities when they see that there's life emerging. And it's true that you find pensioners in the peri-rural areas, whereas the younger generation will be in the smaller peri-urban towns. So that might be the difference. But having said all that, so peri-urban areas are not places of relegation where in other words, those that are left behind end up eking a miserable living. There are areas seen as buffer spaces where changes and adaptation can occur, but you have a renewal of traditional patterns and that might challenge some age-old prejudice on peri-urban life, and because there is life re-emerging there, this will be reflected in policies, and the idea is that slowly but surely new services become available, new jobs as well. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Well, Jean-Pierre Orfeuille.
Je vais faire un peu serious, mais finalement.
That may sound naive, but peri-urbanites are typical French people. They don't like to move around. When they found a town that they like, they don't move away. They don't move away from their parents. They're as diverse as the French population. Can you really talk about peri-urbanites? I mean, we're all urban dwellers, in a way. Well, they're not urban dwellers in the way we imagine them, but based on what you said, this harks back to aspirations which are shared within the whole French population, not just specific to a fringe of the population. And I think that it's a very good thing. We're now in the dead of winter. This is a very difficult year, but research keeps sending optimistic messages. I think it's a good thing. Some will not be happy, economists, because the city has the big labor market, 5.5 million jobs in the Paris region that may be used by anyone living in this territory. Well, that's not something that appears. It seems that people don't want to work too far away from home. The only question that I have, the critique that I have, is my feminist tendencies. Of course, women in peri-urban areas look for more local jobs, but are these jobs necessarily of the same quality, at the same level as what they would have had elsewhere, or have they simply turned their back on promotion? Well, very quickly about women, what we very often saw is that women were civil servants in the broader sense, who have the possibility to apply for transfers. Very often there are also executive women, because there are more and more of them. And maybe compared to the Seine-et-Marne territory in the east of Paris, the territory that we study reaches far west of Paris, up to Mantes-la-Jolie. But it's not so far from Paris. But what struck me is that this is an area where there are fewer and fewer blue-collar jobs. The relationship between the number of active resident men compared to the number of men employed is deteriorating, but the number of employed women is growing. That doesn't mean that these are lower quality jobs. There aren't any more part-time jobs for women than there were in 1999. That's reassuring, but maybe that's a good thing. That's the good side of Paris, the West, although there are big housing estates and so on. So we didn't know that, but you can extend the fight through the peri-urban. And the thing is that men are also concerned affected by this type of relocation also. But is it supply following demand? Because all these jobs that you're talking about, you say that people don't really move around a lot, move houses a lot, and they still find jobs. So does this mean that companies have understood that sometimes there was a pool of labor in some areas when they didn't imagine that 30 years ago? Well, there are two types of answers. First of all, the new cities were decided a long time ago, but it took a long time for them to become major employment centers for people who did not live in the new cities, the new towns. So there are executives who settled down in the Vexin or elsewhere because there were jobs in La Défense or Cergy-Pontoise, which is not so difficult to reach from the peri-urban. And then there are presence-based jobs in these residential towns, jobs that are created to serve the population as it grows. So here there are a lot of female jobs, but not only, because there are fewer and fewer resident workers, but more and more men employed. One last comment, Jean-Pierre Orfeuille, or will we give the floor to Rodolphe Audier? Well, maybe just a matter of interpretation. You probably can't demonstrate what you're claiming, but maybe in a way it's a symptom of the fact that In a way, we have reached the limits of the improvements in our transport system, motorways or rail. I've said that very quickly, but for households, this is something that they can feel more and more acutely. 20 years ago, if you asked people who settled down in the peri-urban, they said that they would look for jobs elsewhere. Well, they would look for jobs closer, but they never did that because they preferred to go to the city because it was more lively and so on. But now when people can find jobs closer to home, they take it because of transport difficulties.
Den Rechten.